Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our session on protecting athletes and clubs on the dangers of problem gambling harm. My name is Mike Huber. I own and operate a mental performance consultancy, as well as I serve as an advisor for Epic Risk Management, the sponsor of the session, and I have almost 10 years in recovery from a problem gambling addiction. Just want to introduce our panelists quickly, and we'll get right into the discussion and try to leave a few minutes at the end for questions if anybody has any. So with that, I will introduce first to my left, Carol Banks, who's with the NFL Players Association. Kirsten Kleckner-Alt with Youngstown State University. Rachel Jankowski-French with the Chicago Fire FC. Howard Webb with the Professional Referees Organization, and John Millington with Epic Risk Management. So with that, the first question that I'll ask, and I'll open it up to everybody, is in the mental performance coaching field, we often talk about putting the person before the performer. How do you care for an individual's well-being while simultaneously recognizing their primary responsibilities as an elite athlete? Carol, I'll start with you.
Sure. So some of the things that we have done is just really making sure that our athletes understand that there's athlete and. So while they're the main role right now as an athlete, they also have a whole other personal side, other things that they will do post-career. And so we really emphasize that, and we have a lot of programming around it to make sure that they understand that they know what they want to do beyond the game of football.
Okay. Kirsten?
I mean, from a college standpoint, they're student athletes, right? And we always joke that the student word comes before the athlete word. I think that really relates, obviously, once they're playing at that more elite level or even at a club level where maybe the academic piece doesn't factor into it so much. But ultimately, it goes back to how are you supporting that person to get the best athletic product out of them? And if you're forgetting about that personal element, then it's almost like you're not kind of addressing the whole issue. So just making sure that you kind of have that holistic approach to development, including those non-athletic factors, I think is important.
Yeah, for us, I think athletes and the decision makers around them are often primarily concerned with performance, right? But we try and really focus athletes on the fact that they will perform better if they're mentally well and feel supported. And kind of start there with everybody, looking at that as a main factor in performance, and then the conversation moves on from there.
And certainly officials, Howard, are performers as well, right? They're under a lot of pressure. So how do you work with your referees on terms of managing them as performers and putting them first, maybe when they're looked at from a performance perspective?
Yeah, morning, Mike. Morning, everybody. Yeah, it's interesting, whereas most people that you work with work in a team, a big team with a lot of support in one central location. We're pretty isolated. We work on a team, a small team on a match day, but then we go off and live our own life away from that sporting environment. We train alone quite often, and we live pretty normal lives. We're not, even though we work in the professional space, we're not remunerated in the same way that many of the people that we work alongside are. So there's kind of different pressures, because then suddenly you go from this pretty normal life to something that's really in the spotlight, where you're dealing with things that are quite extraordinary from your normal life. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel, because having conversations with you guys has opened my eyes to the need to give more support to our officials outside of just those 90 minutes on the game, which we scrutinise massively, but we don't know enough about them as people.
That's great. It's great perspective to have, and we'll get into more in terms of what the referees and the officials you have in your organization need. So, Carol, I want to make reference to something you said, which is giving your athletes, your football players, and the organization resources. So, what types of resources do you make available to those athletes to help them build awareness and educate them on the consequences of something like gambling?
So we have numerous resources, and this extends to both our active players and our former players and their families. So we try to make sure that we look at the whole player, their family as well. We have dedicated hotlines where they can call and be anonymous, where it's confidential. They can also call in directly to our union offices, where we have a 24/7 support. One of those people is myself. I'm a clinical social worker, and so, we just look at it from an ethical standpoint to make sure that they have those resources. We can get them into therapy next day. We can get them into treatment next day. So whatever needs they express, we have a resource for it to support them, to make sure that they also receive it, but receive it in a confidential manner so that they feel safe and comfortable coming to us.
And Kirsten, you come from it from a little different perspective, right? NCAA is going to be different than professional sports. So what types of resources do you make at the university level?
Yeah, so at the university level, I'd say right now it's an area where we're seeing a lot of growth. I've been fortunate the last couple of years working with John in Epic Risk Management. We do a lot more on the prevention side and the education side. So granted, you're hoping that none of your student athletes at the NCAA level are engaging in sports gambling because of the impacts it could have on their eligibility, but making sure that they're aware of what it is. Some of those risks also carry into other areas. They might not be wagering on their particular sport or an NCAA event, but whether it's horse racing, whether it's cards, I mean, there are very other shapes and forms that it can take. And we know that not every single instance is going to result in a gambling addiction, but if we can provide that education about what it is, how it potentially impacts their performance once they start maybe dealing with some of that stress and some of those outcomes, ultimately, how can we kind of educate them about that? So having speakers come in, one thing that we've recently done on our particular campus is talking about screening incoming student athletes. So are they more, I guess, predisposed to those types of behaviors? Are there higher risks that they've exhibited throughout their life? And then if we were to have an instance where someone comes forward and says, hey, I either need help or I have a problem, putting them in touch with our institutional resources. So obviously mental health services on campus, I like to say that we don't always need to recreate the wheel, right? We're coaches, we're athletic administrators, but we're not licensed mental health professionals. So knowing who those individuals are on your campus, having those good relationships with them helps your student athletes if they're in that instance and they need that additional support.
Thank you. Rachel, question for you. So working in the club, what are some of the life skills or skills that you seek to develop in your athletes to encourage good decision making, right, and protect them against poor choices?
It's a big challenge. We work with everybody through our U13 team all the way through to first team players, so there's quite an age range. And with that dynamic, we have a lot of different stages of development, right? Just in terms of how people develop socially, emotionally, that sort of thing. And we know the prefrontal cortex is your decision-making part of your brain. That's where you decide logical, illogical, risk assessment, this sort of thing. And that's not fully developed in men usually until about age 22 or 23. So for most of the players we're working with, they don't have the capability to use that portion of their brain 100% of the time. So we take that into consideration, knowing that's not fully developed. How do we help you at each stage and age as you go through the club, in the academy, through to the first team? And we have various, educational resources for the younger guys that are more kind of activity-based, helping them understand where they're at in their development. And then also as they get older, we work with Epic specifically on providing sessions for the older guys who are maybe ready for that. And we also do individual consulting with athletes when there's specific issues that come up or if they have questions that they are trying to sort out.
And Howard, I know that your organization is decentralized. It's a bit different, right? It's a different perspective, but maybe could you talk about what sorts of education the PRO does for its constituency, for the referees in the organization?
Yeah, I mean, even though we are decentralized across all of the US and Canada, we do get together every 2 weeks. But outside of those 2 or 3 days every 2 weeks, we have to connect online. We have to connect remotely. And we do that, obviously, in the last 2 years, we've become experts at doing that even more so. But we do that through online seminars, but also through one-to-one coaching. We try to replicate a professional soccer club. We try to put all the pieces in place that you'd find at any club, the one that Rachel works at in Chicago. You know, the positions that they have, we have positions as well that are very similar. And we try to do everything we can to put those officials in the best frame of mind, with as much confidence as possible, and physically in the best shape, so that at 3 o'clock or 8 o'clock, whatever time the game starts, they can deliver the best possible performance, and success is as likely as possible. But the most important thing is their head for us. Yeah, they have to be fit, but we have to put them in that mindset where they can fully focus on the game. They're not carrying lots of baggage into the game. The way we assign officials takes into account previous experiences, who we think is in a good space, good vein of form. Yeah, coaches do that as well. We have other factors as well, because people like to perceive our performances differently to the way that I see them sometimes. And therefore, it's an interesting dynamic as to who goes to what game. Yeah, we thought about getting them all together. It's interesting trying to get everybody to come and live in Jersey City, where I live. People don't always want to come and live in my place. So they live where they live, and we just connect. But we try to replicate that, sports psychology being the most important part, because everything we do is about resilience, self-belief, confidence. People are trying to make our officials think they're wrong all of the time by appealing for decisions that they're not entitled to. It's my throw-in. The player knows it's not. The referee has to have self-belief. When you do make a decision, they then go crazy at you. So it's all about a mental discipline, and we try to give as much support as we can.
That's a great point. John, I'm going to ask you, from your perspective, research indicates that athletes may be more vulnerable to problem gambling for a variety of reasons, one of which was what Rachel said, which is development of the prefrontal cortex. A lot of young athletes are vulnerable to risk-taking behavior. How do we educate helping professionals to recognize the signs and symptoms of problem gambling?
It's a great question, and one we're probably still developing, but I think the key is a combination of everything that these guys have talked about. It's about reaching as many touch points within that organisation as you can. It's about educating them both on their own position within the game and what that means, and how their relationship with gambling can potentially impact that. It's about understanding why they're at risk, or in some cases significantly greater risk. It's about encouraging them to actually start to think about their own relationship with gambling at very different stages. So we don't just approach it from the point of view of gambling addiction, we approach it from the point of view of gambling harm. And research in Australia suggests that 85% of gambling harm can actually occur before the point that somebody's diagnosed as a problem gambler. Case in point, I guess, we've seen in the NFL with the situation with Calvin Ridley, a guy who's lost 12 months in the prime of his career and potentially $10 million from a $1,500 bet. Doesn't have a gambling problem potentially, but I would say that's significantly harmful gambling behavior. It's about helping them to understand that. And then once you've got them to relate or to consider their own relationship with gambling and relate that to their environment or to their peers, it's about then understanding what kind of strategies they can put in place to manage that. So they might identify, actually, I've got a very healthy relationship with gambling, but how do I make sure that that healthy relationship with gambling doesn't become unhealthy? How do I understand my position within the game and the ecosystem of gambling and sport so that what I do doesn't then start to pose a risk to my career or to the people around me? And I think the other side to that is making sure that the people that work with them who have those touch points also understand it and also have the tools that are required to be able to create an environment that A, supports them with that, and B, creates a safe space that if they do feel like they're struggling, they're prepared to come forward and talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what you said resonates with me as a former problem gambler, because it was a process for change, right? I didn't wake up one day and say I have a gambling problem. I gambled for many, many years to the point where it evolved and my relationship continued to change, right? So a lot of times it is bringing that awareness to people till they get to the point of saying, like, I'm ready to come forward and do something differently. So, and anyone can answer this, right? So if I think about my own experiences, if somebody would have challenged me or would have confronted me about my gambling when I was in the midst of it, I probably would have been very confrontational because I would have been defensive, right? So how do we have hard conversations around a subject which for many people tends to be a mystery, right? Gambling is a mysterious behavior for a lot of people. How do we confront and sort of have those conversations in a caring way?
And so, Mike, I think I can start to answer this. One of the things that through the NFLPA, our Professional Athletes Foundation, we have started training mental health first aid to our former players, their families, our staff, because we know oftentimes peer-to-peer is where those conversations or the symptoms and signs and warnings are being seen. But if we don't train others besides ourselves on how to have that awareness, because having that conversation from a friend or from someone that knows you versus someone that you see on the outside might be easier. You might hear it better. but if they don't have the training or the words or the experience, that's a tough place to start and to come in and confront and have that conversation. So we are working to train outside of ourselves so that the peers can be a part of those conversations.
That's great. Kirsten, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my answer is a little bit more general. So my role at Youngstown is I'm a compliance officer, so I make sure that our coaches, our student athletes are following the NCAA rules. So gambling is just one small component of that, right? But I would say I'm used to having difficult conversations in general, whether it's a coach coming in asking about recruiting rules, whether it's a student athlete coming in with a problem. But I think the premise for those conversations is the same, right? It's having a good relationship with the people that you work with the people that you service, and creating that environment where they feel comfortable coming in and talking to you. Yes, at the end of the day, I'm the one that needs to provide information about what the rule is, but that individual is still the ultimate one making a decision, right? The most that I can do is provide them with potential risks, kind of outline some options in terms of which way things will go. But if we had a student athlete with that type of issue come into my office, I would want to make sure that they feel supported, that they know that ultimately I'm there to help, I have their best interest at heart, and that even if I can't personally provide them with help, I'll put them in touch with someone who can.
Rachel, working in the mental health space with the Fire, I mean, how do you have those kinds of hard conversations? And it may not be about gambling necessarily, but just in general, right? How do you approach that when you're working with an athlete?
Mm-hmm. So I'm also a social worker, and part of that is that we have a confidentiality privilege, which goes a long way, having somebody who athletes or staff can go to and say, hey, I have this thing, or I have this question, I need to talk to somebody about it, but I want it kept private. So that's something that I'm able to provide in that space. They know that whatever we share in a one-on-one conversation is confidential. And I think that goes a long way in terms of players feeling like they have access to somebody who cares about them as a person. Mm-hmm. I don't have any decision-making ability around a player. They're not going to lose playing time. They don't have to have any type of specific worry going in and talking to me about something. And I think being around and kind of building rapport before a conversation needs to happen is really important as well, right? So checking in with players when there's not a problem is just as important, and them feeling like they can come to you when they do have an issue they want to talk about.
Sure, and I have the same experiences in my line of work, but I think it's a logical follow-up there is we want to maintain that anonymity, right? Like to give people the space to feel like they can come forward if they have a problem relationship with gambling. So what are some of the resources your respective organizations make available to athletes, to your constituency, so that they could come forward and make a phone call or check in so that they don't feel like maybe they're going to jeopardize and have some sort of consequence attached to the behavior?
Yeah, I mean, from the union standpoint, our goal is always to put the player first and to meet them where they're at and what they need. And so when it comes to problem gambling, if they call, there is going to be, the confidentiality, the resources, and getting them the help that they need. We've already, through Epic, made wonderful partnerships with individuals that are experienced in gambling addiction counseling. So if it needs to be that specific, we have those options and resources. And of course, now with telehealth being as big as it is, we can absolutely get them talking to someone next day. Sometimes they call in and they want to talk with us, and that's okay too. We can fulfill that role, and that's why the union has taken such a stance in making sure that there's mental health professionals there that can handle those incoming calls and be there for some longevity if needed.
Yeah. And Kirsten, we know with the NCAA, there's zero tolerance in terms of gambling behavior, right? So a student athlete may not have the incentive to come forward if they think they have a problem because they're afraid to lose eligibility or a scholarship. So how does Youngstown State address that?
Yeah, I think number one, it's providing them with that hotline, right? There's a national gambling helpline that we try and post on our website and make that available just as a tool in case they do need to call someone and they don't feel comfortable coming to an institutional staff member. At a campus level, I will say that I think it really depends on what type of resources your university has, and there's a wide array there, right? I mean, Power 5 is at one level, you have your mid-major, and then when you're talking about D2 and D3 schools, they might not have the resource to have someone particularly on campus to deal with the issue. So at that point, it's looking at how are you utilizing local resources, right? Are there other groups, either in your area or in your region in the state, that can assist with some of those issues and that you can refer student athletes to? So I would say there's a little bit of a change there in terms of how the on-campus dynamic works, but I think the premise is the same to Rachel's point. It's providing that care to the student athlete and letting them know that ultimately you're invested in helping them through whatever that problem might be.
Yeah. So Howard, I have a question for you. So compromising the integrity of match outcomes can jeopardize an official's reputation, certainly an athlete's, and have long-term financial consequences. What do you think is the best way to educate your officials on the potential dangers or consequences of getting into gambling behavior?
Yeah, I think from my side, Mike, that underpins absolutely everything that we do. If you don't have integrity in your decision making or perceived integrity, then you've got nothing. And this session's about the bottom line and protecting it. And if people don't believe in the product they're seeing, if they think it's in some way not genuine, authentic, if they think it's manipulated or fixed, then they're not going to invest in it. They don't want to be associated with it. And from our side in officiating, of course, that has to underpin everything we do. We make mistakes. Part and parcel of the job we do is making mistakes. People can perceive why those mistakes are made. In all of my experience, they're just honest mistakes, just genuine mistakes. But one or two bad examples that we've seen around the world, one in Germany with a guy called Robert Heuser. We saw with the NBA more recently, an official who went bad and manipulated a game, damaged the integrity or the reputation of the league and all of his or her colleagues throughout the world. So anything that we can do to educate the officials around that, around the consequences, is great, but those things are in place. We have a policy. We don't allow our officials to bet at any point from the start of the season till the end, anywhere, on any sport. But we also employ addictive people. We employ people who are addictive to adrenaline, addictive to the buzz when the game goes well. They're addictive to, but bizarrely, challenging situations because they get a great feeling when they come off the field and they want to do it again. If they don't have that sort of desire, then they're not going to be involved. And with that comes, I guess, a disposition towards other things that are addictive. Hence the reason that we in our group will have some people who want to gamble, of course. So let's talk about it. Let's put it out there. Let's not just have it as the great unspoken and just say there's a policy there. If all you do is shove them in the way of the policy, then and expect that to be a deterrent in itself, then we're not doing our job. So we have to talk about it, understand there will be some people who are vulnerable to it, explain how they can recognize themselves where they're becoming vulnerable, give them the confidence to talk to us about it through input such as what Epic delivers, and hopefully avoid it coming to a situation where they are so vulnerable with millions of dollars worth of debt that they're possibly going to do something that they would never normally do in their rational mind. Because when I heard about this panel, straight away you think gambling, match manipulation, that's immediately where my mind goes. It's not really about that, is it? In the first instance, it's just about this person who's probably never going to fix a match in a million years, but actually is dealing with so much pressure because the gambling, because they're addicted to it, and it's building up pressure at home, it's building up pressure on their finances, their mortgage payments, etc., etc. Nothing to do with match manipulation at that point. So we need to, they are linked, but we need to remember there's dealing with the addiction and the human that's doing that, and then also how we can ensure that education is there to prevent it from moving on to the next stage. And if we go to the next stage, we're kind of done.
Go ahead, John.
I think to kind of add to that point, Mike, what we heard from everybody at the start of this was that they treat the human and the athlete as the same thing, right? And we've got to treat every athlete as a human being. They are vulnerable to the same issues that society are vulnerable. And actually, in cases like gambling, they're more vulnerable potentially. So we have to educate around that. The same risks that the society faces, those athletes are facing on an even greater level. And historically, integrity and problem gambling or gambling harm have been treated as sort of mutually exclusive. But the reality is, if you have a team or a room that has a number of people who are suffering from a gambling problem, that risk of an integrity breach is significantly higher. So you can't treat the two things as mutually exclusive. There is a societal issue that these athletes are facing that could also negatively impact the integrity of the sport. So the two things go hand in hand. And actually, they need to understand those risks that come with their gambling behaviour in order to then understand how that potentially negatively impacts the integrity of the sport.